more questions and to start the sequence over again as needed. As you know, the moderator in each city will establish the order of questions. We ask that each participant give his name and affiliation before asking his question. The questions from all 4 cities will be heard by everyone. And, of course, Mr. Hitchcock will be seen and heard at all times. We're pleased to have you with us, and now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this press conference, Richard Schickel of Time magazine.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the Family Plot Follies. I am particularly pleased to be here. As some of you know, I'm sometimes what I like to think of as a critic, but I'm here less in my critical capacity than as a sometime biographer, friend, and longtime admirer of Alfred Hitchcock and his art. I can't resist a kind of a brief critical comment, which is that it seems to me that this film is Hitch in one of his most entertaining moods, and yet it seems to me also a film that takes up, as his films invariably do, certain themes that have been repeated in his life and in his career almost from the very beginning. But to begin Hitch on a kind of a practical note, I'm sure everyone would like to know how long it takes you to prepare and shoot and get ready for distribution a film of this sort.
Well, Dick, before I answer that, I have to go back to your original comment, and that is about one doing similar themes all through one's career. I believe it was someone who said that self-plagiarism is style.
Just so. Just so.
This particular job, just completed, took about a total of 2 years. That was 1 year in the writing. And while you may ask why so long as a year, I think most of the time was spent trying to avoid the cliche, because invariably one would have said, oh, this has been done before. So ideas did not flow as freely as one would like, and it was the effort to get something a little different. You know, crime is crime, whichever way you commit it. Whether it's a murder, theft, kidnapping, what have you, you're faced with that. The question is, it's like writing a scene where you say, man comes through the door. But the big question is, how?
I think you've said on a number of occasions that it's important to you to be extraordinarily detailed, especially in terms of the visual aspects of the film, on paper before you ever get to the shooting stage.
Well, people often ask this question, and I say I've made it a practice over the years, many years, to put a film down on paper. You see, people say to me, don't you ever improvise on the set while you are shooting? And I say, certainly not. With all those electricians around and everything, I would prefer to improvise in the office.
It's a little cheaper anyway, isn't it?
It's cheaper and it's quieter. And after all, musicians are allowed to put their composition down on paper. And architects can put a building on paper. So why not a film? It's a visual thing. So a mere description of the film on paper should suffice. I think the drawback that a lot of people suffer from is the difficulty in visualizing something. You see, you can't, it's no good for a motion picture putting down on paper, he wondered. Because how do you photograph wondering? So what goes on paper is a description, going back to, as I said, how he came through the door. On his face, knees, or what?
It does seem, in this morning's paper, one of the stars of the picture, Bruce Dern, is quoted as saying that, in fact, he found it very happy working with you, that he found he had a lot of room himself in his performance to go in directions that he felt appropriate to his character, that you were not restrictive in that sense with him.
Well, I'm not. As a matter of fact, I have had occasions with actresses, for example, who came to me extremely tearful and complaining they weren't being directed. So I said, well, I don't direct. There's the script. We've put the film down on paper. The only thing I have to do with you is to tell you when you are doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. And some of them can get in very, very intense, and much too intense. I remember Ingrid Bergman used to get very worked up and say, oh, I don't know what to do here, and so forth. And I used to say to her, Ingrid, it's only a movie.
Well, this is only a television broadcast, but nonetheless we have a lot of people out here with, I imagine, a number of questions. So I would like to open the floor here in Los Angeles, at least, for questions. Right here, front row.
Bruce Russell of Reuters News Agency. What is the mandatory retirement age for a director in Hollywood?
I would say real 12, which would be toward the end.
This lady right here.
Marlene Daly, Australian Consolidated Press. Mr. Hitchcock, you've introduced many new faces to the screen. What do you look for when you're searching for a performer?
Well, it depends upon the character. You know, of course, in the old days, and I'm now going back to the 20s, the leading man had to be handsome, well-groomed, dapper. The woman had to be a blonde, a fluffy blonde, and these were more or less stock characters. But of course today that isn't so. One tends, as I did in Family Plot, go for characters, purely characters.
Gentleman back here.
Stanley Ackerbaum, San Francisco Examiner. Mr. Hitchcock, this film has a great deal less violence, it seems to me, than any of your others. As a matter of fact, there seems to be a deliberate move in the other direction. The one death in the film is accidental. There is no real violence in the film. I wondered if this was deliberate and why.
Well, I've never been a believer in violence. For example, when I made the film Psycho, I deliberately made it in black and white to avoid showing blood running down a bathtub. And I've never been one for violence unless the story called for it. Showing blood, you know, there's nothing to it. It's just photography of blood. It doesn't necessarily contribute cinematically to what the scene is about. So therefore, I think these things should be avoided.
What about the absence of bodies here is what I'm at.
The absence of what?
The absence of death and bodies in this film.
You're saying that there's a, in this film as compared to...
You mean nudity?
No.
You mean dead bodies?
Dead bodies.
Yes,
They're nude as well. Don't want them. They look, a dead body doesn't act.
I think, though, there is a feeling, perhaps, just in contrast to your previous film, Frenzy,
Yes.
which, after all, does deal with a psychopath.
That's right.
I think is possible that what the gentleman's getting at is that, in contrast, this is a film in which all the violence is, in a sense, a violence of the mind, and perhaps you did deliberately veer away from the psychopathic theme to the rather clean jewel theft kind of thing.
That's true. On the other hand, you see, there was kidnapping. And the kidnapping was done with as much decorum as possible.
Mr. Hitchcock, since you brought up the subject of kidnapping, do you sometimes feel that there really isn't much room left for a suspense film when you have events like this morning's paper, kamikaze pilot trying to kill a Japanese financier, or the Patty Hearst kidnapping? Do you sometimes feel that real events have outpaced what you could possibly dream of in a suspense movie?
Well, a suspense movie, at least from my point of view, is giving the audience information in advance, not after the fact. You see, there's a great deal of difference between giving the audience the anticipation as against surprising them. A surprise takes 10 seconds, but anticipation can take an hour. There's a big difference. But most people, you know, they make mystery films, which I don't. I call them mystifying films.
Yes, but you're not really answering my question. I wondered if sometimes you feel that the real life dramas have sort of outpaced the film's possibility of exceeding that, or even giving the equivalent of that.
In other words, she's saying the world is such a violent and disturbing place. Is it difficult for you now?
Yes, because we're fighting headlines all the time.
To the degree, this question raised a question in my mind. It seems to me the crime of our current time is, in fact, kidnapping. There's been an enormous amount of it.
It is.
Is that to a degree? Does that in any way influence your choice of the kidnapping theme, or is it sort of something that filters into your mind and
No, I
way?
didn't say I'd like to do a kidnapping film.
Uh-huh.
What interested me about a story like Family Plot was that it was two sides of a triangle meeting at a certain point. In other words, you started at the bottom. It was like a triangle without a base. And gradually, they apparently had no association whatever. And as they came to their apex, that was the shape of the film. And the climax, the apex, came when these two totally unrelated elements came together. And they came together just as the leading lady rings a front door bell of the house which contains a kidnapped bishop. And that's what appealed to me, was the structure of this story. And the kidnapping and all those elements were part of it, but certainly no great inspiration to me. But the plot was.
Are you, have you ever done a film with a structure at all similar to this?
No, this is the first time.
Yes, gentleman right here.
Craig Moderno from Lawford Publishing Company. Directors such as Francois Truffaut and Brian De Palma have made films that have been Hitchcock-like films. That's what your critics have called them. I want to know if you happen to have seen any of these directors' films and what you may think of the influence you've had on directors nowadays.
I've seen the film, but I can't honestly say that I can see myself or one's technique in them. I think the one thing that Truffaut told me once, what he had learned from me was the subjective treatment. In other words, I'll give you an example of what subjective treatment is. A picture like Rear Window. You get a close-up of a man, you cut to what he sees, and you cut back to his reaction. And the whole structure of that film was done on those lines. In other words, you use the camera or as the person who sees something. It's a definite three-piece structure. And that's what Truffaut had learned. You see, it's like when you see films of automobile crashes, the audience are on the sidewalk. They're never involved. Now, in Family Plot, you are entirely with the audience, with the couple in a car that has lost control. And the whole sequence is composed of close-ups of the people and the road ahead. In fact, I took a step further than they usually do in those sort of scenes. I didn't even include the dash or the window frame or anything. I just took close-ups of the people and the road ahead, which was the emotion they were feeling. I was photographing an emotion, not a viewpoint. So that was a step beyond the Rear Window concept.
Yes, well.
That lady.
Oh, I'm sorry, this lady, yes.
Yeah.
I'm Nancy Anderson with McFadden Magazines and Copley News Service, but I'm also a grandmother of 7, and I think it's in this capacity I want to ask the question. Because there's so little violence in the picture and it's such good suspenseful entertainment, it would be great for family groups, except for some of the very bawdy and blasphemous dialogue here and there. And has there been any thought of editing any of that out to increase your general audience appeal?
Not so far. The people speak contemporaneously, you know. If you eliminated that, I think you would cut down some of the quality of character in the two people.
Father?
Mike Callahan, National Catholic Reporter. The structure, it seems to me, or apparently comes from the original novel, and I was curious, in your adaptation, one thing is to kind of visualize it, the kind of thing you're describing, but do you, when adopting from another medium, do you make large changes in the original medium, and how do you ever consciously kind of put in Hitchcock themes or touches to the
I
original
read the
work?
book twice, perhaps, and never look at it again, and start from scratch. Because if you look at a book and you try to translate it, it's very hard to do. Good literature does not make good pictures. That's been shown again and again.
I think we have time for this gentleman right here.
Yes.
James Mead, San Diego Union. You were a very heavy user of coincidence, and I wonder if you feel that coincidence actually does influence human lives in reality, or it's a fictional person's device to make things progress, either in writing or in filming and so forth?
Oh, I think coincidence belongs to ordinary life. There's a phrase very often used in coincidence which says, "Fancy meeting you." Of all people.
Good morning. My name is Richard J. Obele, and I was wondering, during the production of Family Plot, you had an implant operation for a pacemaker. When you returned to work, did you find that this altered your normal work pattern, or did you look at the film or your subject matter differently?
No effect whatsoever. I'm not even aware that it's there.
Fabulous.
Time for one more. This gentleman here.
Yeah, Tony Pfizer, UCLA Daily Bruin. If I might go back to that car chase for a moment, at what point did you decide to have the emphasis more on the humor than the terror, or the potential terror in that scene?
I think the humor emerged through the players, actually. It's a very fine line between humor and tragedy. But really what that car chase did, it combined both elements, danger, humor, and the thrill of the thing.
I think it's time now for us to go to the first of the other cities. For those of you who didn't get a chance in this first go-around here in Burbank, we will be coming back here for more questions from you, as we will from the other cities. But at this point, I'd like to call upon Jerry Evans in New York, who has arranged his questions, I'm sure, in an extraordinarily intelligent order. Jerry, good morning, and could we have your first question? Are you even there?
I noticed that you and Alma are just celebrating the 50th anniversary, and I hope that you're both in very good health. And may I ask you if you have a new picture working?
We're having a little trouble hearing the questions up here on the stage, but as I picked it up, they're asking if you have another picture in the works at this point.
No, the answer is definitely not. Nothing at all.
Well, perhaps I could ask you, is the process one of slow gestation, or how is it that you go about seeking out material of your sort?
It comes through literary agents. It comes through book reviews from various countries.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, Family Plot was an English book originally. Mm-hmm. One thing we never do, we never actually take material direct from a writer. Mm-hmm. It's too dangerous. If it arrives in an envelope, by that, we feel it, we weigh it. Not to get the quality of the material inside. But the fear of plagiarism, you see. I must digress to tell you a story of a little actor, an actor called, English one, called Alfie Bass. He played in the film with Michael Caine called Alfie. And he was a little Cockney type, and he was in a group of 3, and he was a little too short, so somebody sent for a script for him to stand on and raise him up a little. And the cameraman was very, very slow. And finally, little Alfie Bass said, "Who wrote this script? It doesn't half hurt your feet."
Jerry, do we have another question from New York? Or we're moving, I see, we're moving on to Chicago and to Mike Kaplan. Hello, Chicago, are you there? And can we hear you?
Hello, Mr. Hitchcock. This is Alex Steen of the Milwaukee Sentinel. Getting away from the film per se, you have a reputation for being quite a practical joker in your own part. I wonder if you might tell us what was the best practical joke ever played on you.
On me?
No one would dare.
Never. Never. The best practical joke, one of the best I ever made, was to give a dinner where all the food was blue. And I think Gertrude Lawrence was one of the guests. It was in a private room above a London hotel. Also Sir Gerald du Maurier, who was the leading actor on the London stage. And we started off with blue cream soup, blue trout, blue chicken, and then we had blue peaches with blue ice cream. It was very successful.
Do we have another question from Chicago?
Christine Nilan, the Chicago Daily News. Did you consider any different endings for the film? It seemed to me that there was that huge inheritance sitting there with Kathleen Nesbitt. And did you ever think about maybe Bruce Dern posing as the son himself and making off with the money?
No, never did. Never thought about any other ending except the one that we have in the picture. Because there's no drama in money. Much.
Only if you don't have it.
Yes.
Is there another question from Chicago?
Gene Siskel from the Chicago Tribune. Right now in the movie industry, it seems that violent pictures sell day in and day out the best. I'm wondering how that makes you feel about the profession that you've given your life to. I'm wondering if you're very optimistic about the future of the movie business, and if so, can you point to either people or trends that make you optimistic?
Well, of course, as you know, we're going to have changes in the future. To some extent, I gather there'll be a certain amount of home movies through the use of Discovision. But, you know, many years ago, I attended a New Herald Tribune forum in front of about 300 school teachers, and this was when television was first starting. And I was asked, did I think television would affect the theaters? I said it might a little, but on the other hand, the thing that is really going to be affected is the cloak and suit business, because women will want to go out with a new dress on. It reminds me of those pictures which I call sink-to-sink pictures. The husband comes home and he finds himself confronting his wife who is washing dishes at a sink. And he takes compassion on her and says, look, take off your apron, put a nice dress on, we'll get a babysitter, we'll go out, have dinner, and take in a movie. And she's overjoyed at the prospect of getting out of the house. So they eventually get the sitter, park the car, they have dinner, and they sit in the movie house. And the wife looks at the screen, and what does she see? A woman washing dishes at the sink.
I take it you think there's very little future in that line of work.
Well, I think people will want to go out. Otherwise, it means that if they're going to stay at home all the time, then you're going to have a revolt by the wives.
Do we have another question from out in the Middle West?
Follow up on that question. What about the quality of filmmaking? I was trying to suggest that it seems that we're getting into very crude, broad, violent strokes with sharks biting people, things blowing up, fire spreading, and none of this subtlety that you were talking about that gave you so much pleasure in the making of this film. Are there people that you see working, either young or old people working, that give you the kind of optimism, or are we going to just get blown away with big action pictures?
No, I think big action pictures will have their day. We always had them for the last 20 or 30 years, and we shall still have them intermingled with the more intimate picture.
Another question.
Augusta Callery, Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. I noticed in this movie that there was more symbolism than usual, like with the names Rainbird and Shoebridge and Blanche, and the two kidnapping victims were, like, one was the bishop and the other was the Greek Constantine. And I wondered how much of this symbolism you intentionally kept in there, how much was from the book, or how you feel about that.
I don't think that symbolism meant a lot to this story. They just happened to be names and types, really. I don't look really for symbolism any more than I look for messages in a film. Wasn't it Samuel Goldwyn who once said, "Messages are for Western Union"?
It is true, though, Hitch, really from, it seems to me, the beginning of your career in film, that in particular, religious symbols have played a part in a rather subtle way in your films.
That may be true, but I don't think in a very, very conscious way.
Well, one notices, for example, in this film, the business of the abduction of the bishop right from a place of, normally we think of as the most secure and serene place that we could possibly go, that is to say a church. Is that, we understand that disorder can intrude into even a sacred place? Is that a view?
Oh, definitely, yes. I would regard that as a piece of counterpoint, really.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, you know, of all places to go would be to a cathedral, just as much as you might have a murder in a theater.
Which you've done a few times.
Yes, which, again, it's an effort to avoid the cliché. You see, for example, in that film North by Northwest, I had a situation where Cary Grant was supposed to be put, quote, on the spot. And what was the cliché? The cliché was that he would stand under a lamp on an intersection, bathed in a pool of light from the lamppost. Then you'd cut to a black cat slithering by. Then you'd cut to a window and the curtains would part and somebody would peer out. It would be midnight, the distant clock would chime. So I decided this is all cliché. I'm going to do it in the open air, in the bright sun, with nowhere for him to shelter, and apparently no place from which the assassin would turn up. So I chose flat, open country, and where does the assassin come from? Out of the sky. Now, all that was done to avoid the cliché. And not only that, the attack was contrapuntal by the use of the crop duster. Now, another important point is if you use a crop duster, it must dust crops. So he went to hide in a cornfield, and the crop duster came over and drove him out in front of the road. So there was an example of doing an attempted murder in very unconventional surroundings.
Right. Do we have another question, please?
Mr. Hitchcock, Roger Ebert from the Chicago Sun-Times. The other day I got a call from a graduate student who's doing a paper on the use of the staircase as a motif in the films of Hitchcock. I suggested that she write to you. How would you respond to a question like that, or to academic criticism in general?
I think that staircases are made to go up and down. And therefore, they become very photogenic. That they rise, they take a figure up and down, instead of keeping a figure on the flat. I suppose the most famous staircase I ever used was for a film I made in hold on to your breath, 26. And there it was a film about Jack the Ripper, and Jack the Ripper had to go out at night, about 2 a.m. And the landlady of the rooming house in which he lived sat up in bed and listened. And I had a staircase built 4 flights high, and we had to photograph her from the studio roof. And looking down the well, you saw the continuous handrail and just a white hand sliding down the whole way. Of course, today with sound, we would do creaks on the stairs. But that was the most valuable use of a staircase under those needful conditions.
Another question.
Indiana Post-Tribune. Mr. Hitchcock, I enjoyed the film very much, but I noticed one scene that seemed all by itself, separated from the rest of the film, and that was the second scene in the cemetery, when the camera came away and you saw them like working their way through a maze, and it seemed rather a romantic kind of image that you had created. Is there any particular reason for it?
No, it had a practical value. It showed a kind of a chase, and I was possibly influenced by the paintings of Mondrian, which are a series of lines, straight lines converging into various squares and turns. And I felt it was just a fresh way of doing a small chase, instead of just cutting from one figure to another or cutting to the feet. It was a more spectacular way, but nevertheless its purpose was to show that our hero was getting nearer and nearer to his goal, which was the woman.
I also thought what was rather witty about that scene was the fact that he never left the path that he was on. He could have cut cross lots, as it were, and he did not. The notion of staying on the path I thought was kind of humorous.
Yes, well, it was. It was humorous to the extent that you do try and preserve in a cemetery some decorum.
Exactly so. Is there another question?
Charles Callery, Fort Wayne, Indiana Journal-Gazette. You mentioned that you don't intentionally go in for symbolism, though there would be, say, in the names, quite a bit of symbolism on the part of the writer, such as Adamson's name, the son of Adam, and the good and bad symbolism. And you did put Blanche, for example, in a white car, which goes along with the good angle there. Was that intentionally, or how did that just happen?
They got you now, Hitch.
The white car was definitely used to let the audience know whose car it was. One of the things they make mistakes in film, they get an audience confused. They make an audience say, now wait a minute, which cars is whose and what? These have got to be identified. And if you're going to get suspense, you've got to make everything very clear to an audience, especially where the diamond was hidden in the house. I had to make that, if I may say so, crystal clear. But an audience wondering is not an audience emoting. That is why the clothing or the types of people you use must be extremely distinctive so that the audience know who is who, and they must not wonder. They must not nudge each other in the theater and get confused. I had a very interesting story showing audience confusion where one of my assistants went to see a performance of a musical, Sweet Charity, and in the intermission when the lights went up, behind her were two women with their husbands. And one woman said to the other, "Oh, I do like her, don't you?" And the other woman said, "Well, I've always liked Barbara Streisand." So one of the men said, "What are you talking about? Barbara Streisand is in Funny Girl." So the other woman said, "Well, this is Funny Girl, isn't it?" That's confusion.
Well, we're going to try and solve some earlier confusion. Apparently the line to New York is now open, so we will leave Chicago briefly and try once again to get in touch with my colleagues in New York and with Jerry Evans. Do we have a question from New York? We are awfully sorry, New York. We still can't hear you, and we're going to keep working on that. We will now, however, go to Dallas to Bill Burton, who is organizing our seance down there. Bill, do we have a question from Dallas?
Yes. This is Don Saffron of the Dallas Times-Herald. Mr. Hitchcock, in your reference before to self-plagiarism, at what point does it cease being style and become a cliché?
Well, the cliche belongs to anyone except me.
Well, there's a brief answer. Next question.
Mr. Hitchcock, Patrick Taggart of the Austin, Texas American Statesman. You, perhaps more than any director I've seen lately, are generous to women, both in the number of roles you give to them and the kind of parts they play. Is this a conscious effort of yours, or is this just part of being Alfred Hitchcock?
Well, you know, the use of women in pictures is historical and inevitable. I've often been accused of using cool blonde women. I think this is because I personally, on the screen, have an objection to the type of woman who wears her sex round her neck like jewelry. Great big baubles, I think they would be called. And I don't think it's interesting to put a label on a woman and say, oh, she's sexy. I think it has to be discovered whether the woman who can look like a beaky-nosed school teacher, and you'll eventually discover it when you are both alone in a taxi. But otherwise, I think that the women should be discovered in the course of the story. The cool blonde type, I think, comes from Northern Europe. Scandinavians, the Scottish, the English, the Norwegians, and perhaps North Germany. I think the further south you go in Europe, the more obvious they are. I won't go so far as to say they're obvious enough to walk around carrying a rose by its stem in her mouth, but I think the sex should be discovered in the course of the story. You can't walk along the street, walk along New York in Fifth Avenue and point to every type you see and say, well, she's sexy, she's not sexy, or he is. It has got to be found out. And I think that's part of storytelling.
One thing that does occur to me is that perhaps what the gentleman was referring to is there's been a lot of talk of late that there are not or have not been as many good roles for women in films in recent years as there has been in past years, and which leads me to point two, which is that there's a very good role for a very good actress in Family Plot, namely Barbara Harris.
Yeah.
And I thought perhaps you might want to comment first on the general point and then on the more specific point of Barbara's performance.
Well, the general point is that it's true they haven't written so many stories about women. I think the stories about women go back to the end of the 19th century. Who was the great French playwright Sardou, who wrote the plots for some operas and so forth. And he said, Sardou, he was preceded by Scribe, but Sardou said, torture the woman as a piece of dramatic. And the trouble is today, we don't torture the women enough.
Is that to the degree that suspense requires, I mean, what you're saying there is that the woman in peril is in some sense more attractive to us or more attractive to an audience than perhaps a man in peril?
Well,
which is allegedly the innocent,
you
the
take
helpless.
The earliest days, Dick, the earliest days in films, who was tied to the railroad tracks? The woman. It was always the woman who was. What was the serial called in the silent days? The Perils of Pauline. Nobody was interested in the perils of George. And all through we've had the woman in trouble. But somehow, maybe it's due to women's lib that they can look after themselves more than they were used to. But it is true that there are more men than there are women, but I believe that really is due to the fact that customs have changed, that women are no longer what used to be called the weaker sex.
Do we have another question from Dallas?
Yes, Eric Gerber, Houston Post. I noticed in the credits last night there was no producer listed, and I'm curious about that. And secondly, I'm given to understand that Roy Finnis was originally cast in the role of Arthur Adamson. I'd like to know if that's true and more or less what happened.
Well, the reason there's no producer credit, because I'm the producer, but I've never taken credit for it. And I have, in my time, done some writing, but I've never taken a writing credit. In regard to the actor, that was miscasting on my part. I felt that he was too nice. He didn't have enough sinister quality. And that's how I came to make the change. And I chose a man who was more sinister, who had previously played Robert F. Kennedy.
We have another question from Dallas, please.
1, 2, 3. This is Patrick Taggart again from Austin. You said that you have not you don't have any specific projects right now, but will there be a 54th film by Alfred Hitchcock?
Definitely, yes.
Next question.
Jerry Rush from the Arkansas Gazette. I've enjoyed your suspense very much, Mr. Hitchcock. I'd like to know if you would consider doing a suspenseful Western, perhaps with John Wayne.
No, because the trouble with my doing other types of films is that there's not enough detail in them. In other words, I haven't any idea what a loaf of bread costs in a Western. Just as much as people say, why don't you make a costume picture? And I say, well, the trouble is that no one in a costume picture ever goes to the toilet.
In other words, do you feel that suspense derives, you've said before, suspense derives from audience knowledge, but in some way I felt in conversing with you that details about everything from the train schedules of Europe to what we were talking about yesterday, the herring run in England, that somehow that stuff, though it may not be specifically related to the film, in some ways enriches your ability to make the film. Can you talk about that? What is that need for detail that you may not specifically use on the screen?
Well, the need for detail is to create a greater audience identification. The audience are familiar with certain things. Yeah, I've never seen a man try on a Stetson in a Western.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen him in the store buying what they used to call chaps. I don't mean English chaps, old chap and all that. I mean those furry things. Never seen anything like that.
We have another question, please.
Patty Moore, the Dallas Morning News. Mr. Hitchcock, I understand that Shadow of a Doubt is one of your favorite pictures. Could you tell us why?
Well, because, first of all, a lot of pictures up to that time had been made on the back lot. And this time, with Thornton Wilder, we eventually sought out a town in Northern California, just about 50 miles north of San Francisco. And we went and stayed in the town and got to know the price of everything, the houses, the bank, and all the detail. And then we went back to the town and shot the whole film there. And I found that very, very satisfying. We even, there were townspeople were so good to us that they allowed us to take the regular bus, including all the passengers, off its main route and down the route in which we were shooting. And we got tremendous help, and it also satisfied me in this respect. It was a melodrama, but it was full of character and various characters. The central figure was a murderer, but attractive, and in many ways, in many aspects, family plot comes close to that in terms of character, not necessarily in terms of crime committed, because in the case of Shadow of a Doubt, the crimes had already been committed.
Do we have another question then from Dallas?
Mr. Hitchcock, this is John Buston from the Austin Citizen. I recall, I believe, that originally Family Plot was entitled Deceit. Could you tell us what went into the change of title?
Well, I felt the word deceit suggested a bedroom farce. It suggested it was rather a mild word. It didn't carry any meaning with it. Pictorially, when one began to think about deceit, there you had the woman in bed, the husband entering the bedroom, and the lover secreted behind a curtain where there was a row of the women's shoes and two big boots of the man standing out. And that, to me, epitomized the word deceit. It wasn't good, I didn't think.
We have time for another question from Dallas.
This is John Buston again. You were speaking of symbolism, and I recall in North by Northwest, kind of a famous symbol that you created with the train tunnel. You recall that, and if so, could you explain a little about what you had in mind?
I think that comes under the heading of pornography ahead of its time.
Do you have another question from Dallas? Okay, we're going to try one more time for New York, and hope that the lines are finally clear. Can you hear us, New York, and can we hear you?
Graciela Lecube for Buen Hogar, Latin America. Mr. Hitchcock, you always talk about surprise about your movies, and I was surprised for two little shots. Why did you show yourself in a shadow, and why did you have Barbara Harris at the end wink at us instead of you winking at us like you're doing from the poster?
Well, Barbara Harris really winked because she was telling us that she was not psychic, because while being carried through to the cellar, the sodium pentothal or whatever they stuck her with hadn't taken, so she posed as being unconscious, and she actually heard a reference to the chandelier by the two kidnappers. What was the other part of the question?
About yourself in shadow.
Oh, in shadow. That was sheer modesty. Another reason was that it was very short, so that I wouldn't have to suffer the indignity of being an actor for too long.
Next question.
Tom McElfresh, Cincinnati Enquirer. Mr. Hitchcock, is there maybe a MacGuffin gone wrong? It seemed to me Karen Black put the wig into the refrigerator when they returned. Why?
Well, when she came to put it on, it was nice and cool.
It's also an odd place to put a wig, just at the simplest level. Next question.
Roberta Plutzik, Buffalo Courier Express. Earlier, another questioner described you as being Alfred Hitchcock. At this stage in your life, do you ever think about being Alfred Hitchcock, a person that all of us everywhere revere and admire? Do you have any philosophical comments on that?
What's it like to be Alfred Hitchcock?
Not very comfortable. I don't know. It's I'm somewhat of a loner. I don't flaunt myself publicly unless there are occasions like this. But I suppose one must be honest and say it's very pleasant when the film turns out to be all right. But when the film isn't good, then it's a very miserable condition.
Next question.
Mr. Hitchcock, Norma McLean's Stoop, After Dark. Shots that interested me in family plot were when you had the camera not only focus on, but hover on finger marks around light switches and closet handles. Was that because of your love for detail, or was it symbolic?
Finger marks around. She noticed. Lady noticed a lot of finger marks around the wall switches.
I think it's very hard to switch on lights and leave a full fingerprint. It's just a flick. That's all it is, and probably would end up